Well, thanks everyone, and certainly thank you to Yale University for hosting this very important discussion today. This is the penultimate session and the final panel of the Yale Global Justice Conference, a conference that has really been remarkable in many ways. We just finished, of course, a powerful discussion about the humanitarian crisis, catastrophe really in Yemen, and solutions brought forward by some of the world's foremost experts. Through the course of the conference, we've centered on progress against poverty in important regions of the world and specific countries. We've also talked about the challenges at play, as one of our speakers brought to our attention on our first day of the conference, the fact that in the last year, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, 25 years of global gains against poverty have been erased. So as we think about solutions, and innovative solutions have really been the underlying and overriding theme of this conference, we thought it would be useful to bring together pioneers in the field of impact investing, those that are really what I call changing the character of capital and directing investments for social good, whether in local communities or areas throughout the world. Many of the people on our panel today are true pioneers in this space. I've had the opportunity to work with them closely or otherwise to watch them in awe as they have built new models, tested new approaches, and illuminated, I think, for the world opportunities to improve this space and to expand and scale the power of impact investment. Today we have with us a very full panel, and appropriately so, because each of these players here, they are powerhouses in their own right. Many of them know each other, and it gives us the opportunity to take the power of personal chemistry and past history and bring it together into a rich and I hope very lively discussion. I've promised our audience, and I've certainly promised our panelists, that we would have the chance to reflect on in a very personal way, certainly about their own journeys into this space and about their own journeys since pioneering certain aspects of the space. Many of the people here have rich and storied careers. Many of the people here wear multiple hats and can share the power of their multidimensionality, the power of being able to have worked in multiple industries in multiple contexts, and the perspectives that brings. I'm happy to announce our panelists as follows. We have Gerhard Pries, who is CEO and founder of Sarona Asset Management, one of the world's foremost leaders in emerging market investing. Sarona Asset Management is based in Canada with offices globally. We have Nadza Durakovic from Bluemark, a powerful new set of tools are being created right now under the Bluemark umbrella to improve what has been a very important theme of this conference, and that's impact measurement. How do we gauge our progress? How do we gauge the progress of those claiming progress with respect to impact investments? Bluemark is bringing an enormous amount of clarity, and certainly clarity of vision, to this space, paving the way, leading the way. We have Geoff Davis from Sorenson Impact. Geoff is someone I've known for many years, and I've watched him, again, in awe as he has moved from setting to setting, driving forward new ideas and new innovative models to drive progress certainly in local communities that are underserved or otherwise throughout the world. Gabrielle Gay is from Kensington-SV Global. Gabrielle we'll talk about Gabrielle's enormously powerful thought leadership. We'll talk about recent publications that she's brought forward and what she's doing to unlock untold resources into the impact space. We have Oliver Niedermaier, my great friend and someone that I've partnered with over the better part of the last decade. He leads Tau Asset Management, a private equity firm that's focused on driving social and environmental impact with a focus on high density workplaces, namely factories in Southeast Asia and beyond. We have Aina Fadina from Atento Capital, new to the impact space, but someone who has been driving innovation and certainly a social entrepreneur with her media empire through Eye of Africa and so forth. We have Alice Lynn Fabiano, my longtime and beloved colleague from Johnson & Johnson, who has been innovating as an entrepreneur within the context of the world's largest healthcare company, and now leads on a global basis J&J's impact investing strategy. We have Pradeep Kakkatil, who's head of the UN Health Innovation Exchange, someone that I've had the opportunity to work with for many years, who within the UN context has driven innovation and driven an embrace of innovation that is nothing short of inspiring. And finally, we have my good friend, Joanne Manrique from the Center for Global Health and Development, who has been a pioneer on many levels in driving the connection between the public sector and the private sector through much work and many convenings, has helped to unlock some of the most powerful public-private partnerships that we've seen on the planet. So with that, we will start our discussion. And Nadza, I wanted to start with you, if we could, in part because we just had this discussion on Yemen, where conflict-imposed displacement was a key part of the discussion. So the panel preceding this one, highlighting those challenges in Yemen, which now constitute the world's most severe humanitarian crisis, has me thinking about you and your own past. You are a survivor of war, and you are twice a refugee. So I'd love for you, as we kick off, to tell us about your own personal journey into the impact investing space and how the experiences of your youth led you to what you're doing today. Nadza?
Thanks, Jami, for this kind introduction. And well, as you can imagine, the war experience and refugee experience has shaped my life in very profound ways. My family and I are Bosnian Muslims, and a few days before my 5th birthday, the Serb army invaded our small town in the north of Bosnia. And I remember celebrating my 5th birthday, hiding in a basement while listening to grenades explode all around us. It is in that way that we survived for about a year of the war before we managed to escape in the cover of darkness by crossing the river Una that forms a natural barrier between Bosnia and Croatia, and ultimately winding our way both by foot and train to a refugee camp in Germany, where we spent about 10 years of my life there, and then ultimately ended up as refugees in the US for a special refugee program for Bosnians in the early 2000s. So I would say all that experience has been traumatic, and it did expose me to sides that no child or no person should ever have, but it did instill in me 2 concepts early on in my life. One is that survivor's guilt is a real driver, and it's something that many war survivors grapple with. I don't think many of us fully manage to overcome it, but this question of why am I alive when many others aren't, has been the key driver. And I realized that despite all the horrors and the trauma, I do have the privilege to be alive and to be given this gift of life. And I have this incredible need to give back because of that and put that privilege to work. And that is one way that I've dealt with that. And I think that's part of the reason why I've come to impact investing. The other one is that I was exposed to a duality of human nature very early on. I've seen some of the worst that man can be and some of the absolute best and bravest. One of the reasons why my family and I survived is because my mom's best friend was a Serb who decided to put her life at risk and on the line by hiding us in her basement for the better part of the year. And it was a very difficult thing to wrap your head around as a 5-year-old, and certainly a difficult thing to wrap your head around now. But I did realize that despite all of the horrors, we as humans can rise above our baser instincts in many ways. And I wanted to instill, at least in my career, this core of humanity into systems and work that might otherwise be considered fairly cold and callous, like much of our own capital markets, and to translate some of those very cold numbers and data into actually meaningful life experiences on the ground. And so when I came across impact investing, it represented in some ways the perfect mechanism by which I could satisfy those principles in my life. And I don't want to say that impact investing is in and of itself perfect. I think we will allude to that later on in the discussion today, but it is that path that ultimately brought me there. And also to Bluemark, which you mentioned is a verification service and a space where I get to grapple with this question of, as impact investing grows and becomes more mainstream, how we can ensure that it does so with integrity.
Fantastic, thank you. So Aina, I wanted to turn the conversation to you next, in part because you yourself have deep ties to a place well outside of the US, and that is the country of Nigeria. You have been a social entrepreneur in bringing attention to the vibrant, dynamic, high potential place that Nigeria is, and certainly the broader continent of Africa. You have brought forward very important segments through your work in media and your leadership there to shine a light on places that are maybe less well understood in terms of their potential. And today you've moved to Atento Capital in a new role. And interestingly, thinking about the evolution of the impact space, Atento terms its work not impact investing per se, but mission aligned. So Aina, I'm just a huge fan of the work that Atento is doing. Now it's focused obviously on maybe a more local space than what your career has had in terms of focus in the past. I'm curious, what are you looking to do in your new role? What does this term mission aligned mean at Atento Capital? And what are you hoping to learn as you step into this space with a fresh voice and with much experience behind you in many contexts?
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever everyone is. Aina, Fadina, thank you all so much for being here today. And Jami, thank you so much for the invite. And quite honestly, it's a bit intimidating hearing all the stories that all of you have and the experience that you have. So I'm really here to learn and hopefully create some value to what I have to say. So as I think about my journey into this space, quite frankly, as an African, I was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and moved to the States as a teenager. And quite frankly, I struggled, I do a lot of air quotes, with the term impact vesting and the lens in which it's done, especially through an African perspective. And the reason why I started my web series, Eye of Africa, was to celebrate innovative thinkers, entrepreneurs, and investors who are inspired by Africa through a global lens. It's very easy to sort of blame mainstream media about sort of where Africa should be, who we are as people, within the complexities of who we are in our cultures, just the beauty and the essence of how we show up into the world. And I always say, with adversity, we still persevere anyway. So that's what I wanted to highlight through Eye of Africa. And when the role at Atento came to me, quite frankly, I actually went back to read my business school essay because I had 3 other offers on the table. And I asked myself, given the context of how I thought about impact vesting, given the context of the work that I wanted to do, how does this experience sort of get me there? So at Atento, I am the head of platform and investor, joined about 2 months ago. And Atento Capital is a venture arm of Judge Kaiser Family Foundation. It's a Tulsa-based foundation and VC. And like I said, I went back to read my business school essay to kind of understand my why, because I think I mentioned something about allocation of capital. Like I wanted to go to Kellogg to get my executive MBA to understand sort of the venture world, allocation of capital, empower entrepreneurs. In addition to that, build ecosystems globally. And I didn't realize globally was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but I embraced it because at the end of the day, my life and my career has always been about sort of the building blocks to where the final journey or where the legacy intends to be. And at Atento, I'll kind of give a brief sort of mission around Judge Kaiser first, since the foundation is the umbrella of who we are. And Judge Kaiser always sort of starts with this, where he says that, and this is Judge Kaiser's words, I had the advantage of both genetics and upbringing. As I look around at those who did not have these advantages, it's become clear to me that I have a moral obligation to direct my resources to help and repair the inequities. No child is responsible for the circumstances of his or her birth. And as I mentioned, those are the words of Judge Kaiser. And he's really passionate about reducing the cycle of poverty in Tulsa. In addition to that and beyond, in addition to that, the foundation aims to educate, assist families out of generational poverty through programs focusing on education, job assistance, parenting and prenatal care, alternatives to incarceration for mothers who have committed nonviolent crimes. And as we think about how Atento fits into that, as I mentioned, we are sort of the venture arm of the foundation. GKFF is our sole limited partner. And with this unique relationship, it kind of allows Atento to draw entrepreneurs and leaders who share the same vision of growing a more vibrant, more inclusive Tulsa. And I'm sure a lot of you on this call know the atrocities that sort of happened about 100 years ago and beyond that in Oklahoma and in Tulsa. And Atento and GKFF is working collectively to sort of bridge that gap between all these different communities. So with Atento, we invest in, with the intention of bringing these benefits to Tulsa, we have 3 sort of investment vehicles. There's a direct investment vehicle, there's a non-direct investment vehicle, and then we also have a fund-to-fund strategy as well too, with the backing of about $4.5 billion of the foundation that we have. And our goal is really to think about how do we invest in underrepresented entrepreneurs, as well as providing financial incentives for business to relocate to Tulsa. In addition to that, our goal is to really look at organic job creation to occur as Tulsa businesses continue to evolve and grow and thrive. Prior to sort of what we're seeing now, Tulsa was actually huge for oil and gas and aerospace. And over the last 20 years, there's sort of been a brain drain that's happened. So GKFF and Atento is really thinking about economic development and how is it sustainable long-term. So as I mentioned, I had to sort of like reposition my mindset around the notion of impact vesting and really think about it, because my role has always been global, like you said, and like really think about it from a more localized perspective and how can these local changes in Tulsa activate to Oklahoma, activate to the Midwest, and then the coast that we have, and then eventually globally around the world. So it's been an interesting journey. I've been here for only about 2 months, a lot to learn. And even for myself, for me to understand and continue my why, as I hope to take the lessons through here and go back to Nigeria at some point in time in my career.
Thank you, Aina. I think this connection between global and local, as we think about the power of impact investing and how it operates, is really important. I also think what you said about sort of building blocks in your career is an important theme that we'll carry out throughout this discussion. And I think of those who molded building blocks, and I think almost automatically of Geoff Davis. So Geoff, when we first met at this point more than 20 years ago, you were working to advance and scale microcredit, which at the time was in some ways seen as this be-all end-all solution, certainly more proliferated since then. And the Groom Union Foundation, where you were, achieved so much and continues to do so. But you've gone beyond even microcredit, where your focus set initially, and you've been an extraordinary innovator, building the blocks of impact investment through many different modalities. So can you share with us some of your experience and the lessons you've learned as an innovator in this space, really pioneering new models, whether it be on the local level or more expansively?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And thanks for pulling this together. As we mentioned in the green room, it's incredible to be. Someone's muted me. Can you hear me? Okay. It's incredible to be here together with all of these amazing pioneers and leaders in this space. This is really fun, and I wish we were really having a brunch together, as you alluded to earlier. We'll need to do that sometime. Jeffersonian brunch. So yes, you asked me to share a bit about what I've seen and learned over the last 20, 25 years doing this, and I don't feel old enough to be able to say that, but it indeed has been that long. And you also mentioned that part of this is to help bring inspiration to those who are the next generation and the students. So I thought I might tell a story, if that's okay, and then extract some of the principles and the learnings. And we can cycle back to, I'm going to focus on an experience in the microfinance space, and then we can cycle back if we want to talk about other things that I've been doing since. So early on, while at university, I started a number of businesses, and I got very interested in how business might be used to do social good. And I learned about microfinance, and got this harebrained idea that I was going to start a microfinance company to see if I could help it grow. And so I sold one of my companies, and I went to Mexico and set about designing a microfinance organization. It's 1995 or something, where most microfinance was driven by grants and donor dollars and things. I tried, mostly since it was my money, I wanted to figure out if we could design it to cover its own costs, and that worked. And then a bit later, I was at a conference and met Mohammed Yunus, who founded the Grameen Bank, and later won the Nobel Prize for that effort, and told him some of what I had done there. And he asked if I would come and join. He was trying to start something called the Grameen Foundation, which you mentioned, in Washington, D.C. And so I was able to help get that started, and I worked with him for 3 years, getting that up and running. And as we did that, the effort we were doing was to try to take basically at that point, every self-respecting organization doing some kind of development work decided they wanted to have a microfinance program, and I'm using your air quotes, to do so agricultural extension programs would add a microfinance part, and rural education programs would add something on microfinance, et cetera. And so our job was to help them add microfinance to what they were doing already. And we saw that the programs would start off and grow to a certain size and then level out, and they would stop growing. It was about $1 million worth of loans typically. And that was curious, because I had seen that we could run them in a way that they were self-sustaining. So I went back to graduate school and tried to understand what was going on. I did a large study with McKinsey globally on the constraints of microfinance globally. And we found in that study the same things I had seen anecdotally, that the growth constraints came down to two pretty simple things. We called them capital and capacity. So these organizations didn't have the money to grow because they viewed themselves as a development activity, and they were nonprofit driven, and so they were running around trying to raise donor money all the time. And second was the operating capacity. They grew up keeping their books, their accounts in Excel, and didn't have systems, didn't systematize things. Their whole focus was on helping usually the women grow their business, start a business, grow a business, and then get the money back. Well, those two things, I realized, wait a second, those have been solved elsewhere. And so ended up after graduate school with a few other people starting a company called Unitas, which combined venture capital, investment banking, and consulting, strategy and operational consulting, to supersize, we said, supersize successful microfinance programs. And so we did a couple of those, trying to help them grow. And then we had an annual retreat after about 18 months or something like this. And we said, okay, we've done this twice now. This is kind of working. Where do we want to go from here? And some people on the team were saying, we should do 5 more of these. Man, this is really making such a big impact. And at the time, we'll laugh at it. At the time, we had 21,000 loans, microloans. You think, okay, we should try to get to 100,000. Wow, that would be amazing. 100,000 families. So, 500,000 people. And everybody was excited about that. And we paused, and then we stepped back and we said, but wait a second, where is this really going to go? What good? So that 500,000 people or the 100,000 families, that's amazing. But there are some fundamental structural issues here. If we go bigger, why are these not scaling more global? We're not going to solve this problem on our own. We're not going to reach probably 3 billion people on our own that needed access to these. And so why aren't the capital markets coming to play here? Why aren't consulting firms helping with this? Why aren't venture capitalists investing in microfinance? And we started asking ourselves some of those questions, and identified some of the answers and some of the reasons. And that led to us saying at the time, we said, we want to set a goal then of reaching 10 million families in about 10 years. And at that point, that was about, I think, 7% of something called the Millennium Development Goals. back then, the predecessor to the SDGs. And you know, we were this small group of maybe 5 or 6 people sitting in a small little office in Seattle, saying, are we is this crazy? We're going to actually a measurable impact on the Millennium Development Goals. And we said we were going to do it anyway. And so that we set about doing it. We realized our biggest impact would come if we provided a demonstration effect that others could copy. And so we had to do what we were doing very, very well, but then we also had to be very smart and strategic about communicating that outward and creating a replicable model that others could replicate and then come in behind us. And we kept trying to hire the best people we could from wherever we could find them and got to work. And so we hit that goal of 10 million families after about 6 years. So instead of 10 years, 6 years, and eventually helped 15 million families work their way out of poverty. And then, you know, there was this big whoosh as if we had more time, we could go into it, how we did that, but we brought some of the world's best venture capitalists in the world in, and leading investment banks and other things into the work. And microfinance kind of took off. This was not alone, I should say. Gerhard was a big part of doing all of this, groups at Axion and others around the world. So this was not us alone by any means, but you asked me to share a personal story. So that was my partial view on it. Now let me extract the principles super quickly. 3 things. The first was that it takes about 20% more effort to think 100 times bigger. 20% more effort to think about 100 times bigger. When you think in systems and structures, meaning it's a little harder. You have to think a little bit deeper and get a little more information and whatnot, but the impact can be dramatically greater. Second is that systems are designed by people, no more capable and no smarter than we all are here. And so if we want to change them, we can set about doing that in a very powerful way. And then the third is, you know, when I started all of this, when I started the first thing in Mexico, I was 25 years old. When we started Unitas, I was 29. And so, you know, the students in particular that are listening, if you have some big thing you want to do it. Don't wait until you think you're 40 or 50 or whatever and have enough experience and legitimacy, but go do it. You can make an enormous difference. And then the last point is that markets can be harnessed for social good. I think you called it conscious capitalism. You mentioned at the beginning that this is a real thing, and it's a shift in the mode of capitalism that we're seeing here. I've probably taken up my entire time for the whole webinar, so now I can stop and just drink my green juice and listen to everybody else.
Oh,
Thanks,
Geoff,
Jami.
that was incredible. And it's great to see you again. Thank you. And thank you for extracting those principles. And thank you actually for mentioning Gerhard. I should have assumed that Gerhard would have a role in the greatness behind many of the projects that we'll mention today. And so Gerhard, knowing how much of a builder you are in your own right, and how much, to use Geoff's term, extra whoosh you brought in terms of capital and energy, and that big 100x sort of thinking to many different projects across the world. Can you tell us how you got started? Can you tell us what sparked Sarona Asset Management and its genesis, and certainly give us a glimpse into its evolution over time and what you've learned?
Sorry about that. Just need to unmute myself there for a second. Thank you, Jami. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's uncommon to have a panel or a roundtable discussion on a midday on Sunday, but it's kind of nice. We've just started. The first snow of the season just started up here in Canada half an hour ago, so I'm glad to be inside a cozy home. Just quickly, because we've got not that much time left. My career started with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and then Mother Teresa came along with some books that really screwed up my life. Working in the capital markets or with finance, and then this person starts writing about the poor in Calcutta, and I was intrigued, and I tried to put together, you know, one world versus another world that I was reading about, and so I quit PricewaterhouseCoopers. I quit that whole world, and went to study theology and went looking for Mother Teresa in Calcutta. And eventually figured out that neither extreme works really well, or at least not in my life. Why not put them together? And so that was in the 80s, and in the early 90s, I ran into an organization called MIDA that had started in 1953 as a private company investing in businesses in first Latin America, then Africa and Asia as well. Investing in businesses for two purposes. One was financial return, financial sustainability, and secondly was improving the lives of the communities. And I found that intriguing. So in 1993, I said to them, they had in the meantime become a nonprofit and weren't doing their investing really well. And so in the meantime, so in 1993, I said, let me take this on, spin it into a separate subsidiary company, and I'll improve the professionalization of the investment programs, et cetera. For me, it was critical that the world that I lived in here in North America and was a world that had a relationship with emerging markets, with developing countries, as a giver-receiver. No one in my sphere, in fact, that I knew, understood that it is better to invest in people than give them aid. This giver-receiver relationship was inherently unbalanced. And so when I discovered this organization that was actually investing in entrepreneurs in emerging markets, I thought, holy moly, maybe I can try to bring these two sides of my life, PricewaterhouseCoopers, finance, et cetera, capital markets, together with, I don't know, the Mother Teresa heart that had somehow created the problems in my life. So that was in 1993, and then some years later, we spun it off. We as a management team bought it out from MIDA, the nonprofit. You ask what it was, how has it evolved? A few things. When we spun it out in 2010, that's only what, 11 years ago. We worked only with private sector investors. We had no relationship with government bodies and civil society, et cetera. My focus was, we are intermediating private capital, so private investors over here investing, and they didn't know anything about emerging markets. So it was our job to take their capital and invest it in emerging markets. But in the intervening years, I began to learn a little bit more about the public sector, thanks in large part to Joanne Manrique, who's on the line with us here today, who drew me into conversations with the UN agencies, with sovereign government agencies, et cetera. And I came to understand that for us to build healthy new economies around the world, we got to do it differently than what the capital markets have done before. We really, it requires the public sector and the private sector to work together to build healthy new economies around the world. So we've come to whereas at first I had sworn off all conversations with the public sector because I had a few conversations in the 80s and it was so painful. So I'd sworn that all off, and then came to deeply believe that we really need to bring this together. It has been probably one of the more time-consuming and frustrating endeavors of my life. And I'm pretty much ready to throw it all away. It's the work trying to work with public. It's not rocket science. It's actually pretty simple, but the slow pace of the decision making, the fear of making decisions, is just it's been very frustrating. We're not going to throw it out because I deeply believe it has to happen. But it's not something that's been easy, and we do know that this is not a solution that can be that can be created or implemented by the public sector alone, and neither by the private sector. We are an intermediary of private capital with a very deep theory of change, seeking to be change agents of change. bring about healthy new economies, prosperity for all today, and we're talking about the laterally as well as prosperity for all in the future. So an earth that's there for our grandchildren's grandchildren.
That deep belief has certainly carried you in many ways across many dimensions. And Joanne, I'm going to let you jump in now since Gerhard has called you out, and the way that you work in this space between how you connect private capital with, of course, powerful decision makers on the government side. Gerhard mentioned frustrations. Do you have any based on your work, or could you reflect upon your experience as serving as that bridge?
Thank you, Jami, and thank you for inviting me. And it's good to see old friends on this call. And I think it's, as Gerhard was saying, I think there is frustration, but I think there's also a lot of lessons learned. So we've helped to broker some large funds. Probably in the past 2 or 3 years, but I see Gerhard and I see Pradeep here, and it's things that are largely frustrating. But I can give an example and kind of talk to some of the students as you asked to really inspire them. So we worked with USAID to try to bring forth a public-private partnership that was $250 million. For girls' education into primarily Africa and Asia. And Gerhard knows because he was one of the investors in those early meetings with the public sector. It was quite a process, and it was something that required public sector understanding how to deploy investment capital into different vehicles and government agencies, especially, many of you on the phone are used to dealing with the development finance institutions who understand, how to deploy investment capital. The development agencies don't yet. They're very powerful at being able to provide those tools, such as first loss capital or other de-risking tools that they have at their disposal to create these funds. In the long run, these funds, as you know, make an enormous impact. They are frustrating to start. And, as we've learned from that, education fund, some very small companies in Africa are still benefiting from the fact that they can invest in education. To some of the warriors in this room, which Gerhard was one of them, it wasn't a vehicle that was created in a way that we thought it should be created, right? But it is impacting. It's actually changing the way girls can access education. They can now use, there was investments made into teleeducation. There was investments which have proven to be very successful, especially now under COVID-19, where girls can't get to schools. So a lot of these companies that were invested on about 2 years ago are the primary focus of how these girls are receiving education. And then there's other ventures that, we try to start a fund with the Islamic Development Bank on women's cancers. And that is it's a large development bank, and it took a lot of partners. Pradeep, I believe you were there at some points, and I know Gerhard, you were there. And it was really trying to create a for-profit fund for addressing women's cancers. So it was looking at investments that, across the spectrum, bringing in also other investors who would be willing to deploy their capital into this fund. And some of the investors looked at it and said, this is not doable. Other investors looked at it and said, this is very interesting. So, I think in the experience, it's also personalities around the room. I think we have persevered in some areas in terms of learning from each other and learning how we can do business differently and how we work with large development banks and those large agencies that have different tools and large capital. In the USAID fund that I talked about it earlier, almost 200 million of that fund came from the US government. The other 50 million came from, foundations or women that were, investors into it. But, didn't expect large returns, but it was creativity in trying to get that fund off the ground. And it's still creativity in trying to start, this women's cancer fund and other initiatives that we're part of. But I think it also takes, and it's amazing the people you've put together here, Jami, special type of personalities to be willing to, kind of bang your head against the wall and keep on trying over and over again, because, you're not going to give up. And I think that we are in a unique position to do that. We're not structured as an investment company, we're structured as an NGO. So we work with the governments when they want to deploy their de-risking capital in different ways. And then we also work with net worth, individuals who are women who want to invest their money. And then, with investors such as, Gerhard and UN agencies such as UNAIDS and Pradeep, and, experiment in different ways that we could try to make these funds better. Sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not, but I think we've learned a lot in the past 10 years. So thanks, Jami.
Oh, just fantastic. So Gabrielle, you have, speaking about creativity and special personalities, you've done so much to broaden the pool of investors and to encourage those who have means to become part of this movement and to support high impact, if high risk endeavors. And certainly the case for that is improved every time we're able to prove out a model and prove a success. But sometimes, to Geoff's points earlier, there are sort of 100x sort of thinking. To Joanne's point, there's this highly creative thinking and creative ideas at play, and capital is required to get it started. And sometimes it's the faith and energy of private individuals that spur that start. So Gabrielle, tell us about your recent Harvard Business Review article and the work you've been doing to bring in more high net worth individuals to the work that's being discussed today.
Thank you, Jami. I think there's so many definitions of human development, and one that I thought of today is that development can be defined as layers of solutions on each other. So we talk about all of these frustrations that we're hitting our head against on a daily basis. Every time that we incrementally kind of build a solution there, it's something that others can build on, and you find that societies and individuals can advance that way. So I'll just say that I only write about things that I've done in the field. I'm not just a writer. I'm actually not a great writer. I've experienced certain things working in the throes of efforts on the ground, and I choose to write about those things where I think there are learnings that can benefit others. The article that you referenced, Jami, it was invited as we were embarking into the pandemic. So it was written right at the beginning of that. And it came from a conversation and an experience of, I worked for a family office, and about 8 years ago, I was put in charge of a philanthropic impact portfolio. And one of the big projects was an academic venture in West Africa. And I was at Gap Corporate. I basically jumped on an airplane with very little knowledge about Africa, healthcare, academia. And I jumped in, and for the next 3 years, I spent about half my time there, hitting my head against the wall and solving problems and really understanding what it took on the ground to get an institution stood up. And so my writings come from that experience and the experience that's broadened over time. But potentially, like on a Sunday, maybe it's appropriate to talk about a baptism by immersion, but that's what this was. Is philanthropy is not the tool to advance society at large. It can be a very powerful tool in acute situations of suffering, and so it's a tool that you can use. But as we're talking about human progress on a larger scale, it's not the right tool. And so the learning from being on the ground in Ghana is shifting from a philanthropic mindset to a business. So I went back to the things I learned in an MBA program and my lessons in business and said, how can we restructure these initiatives as businesses and for-profit enterprises? And so this article for Harvard came from that experience. And I would say in a nutshell, what we're looking at is investing in is looking at things through the lens of, rather than expanding the frontier of human progress, expanding the scope of it. So we're not concerned necessarily about about performance, but about participation. So how can we broaden the accessibility of products, services, education to a broader market? So inherent in that is scalability. And so I'm learning so much being on this call today. I work in a very niche area in West Africa, doing very niche things, but we've got a college stood up. It's best in class. We're doing very innovative things with education, and we're starting to build our investment portfolio off of that, because necessary in investments are partnerships and understanding how to leverage those partnerships to the success of a venture and investing in people. And so as we're necessarily on the ground doing that, we can place investments and de-risk them to a certain degree. But I think that's one of the most powerful things is philanthropy is a tool in some instances, but as we're talking about large scale movements of human progress, is not the appropriate tool. Our philosophy is based in entrepreneurship, that the more you resource, and I say that broadly, that includes capital, it includes education, mentoring, connections. As you resource entrepreneurs, you let them build the ecosystem that their environment demands. Rather than we thinking that we know in the West often what these emerging markets need, we don't, and we don't understand it. And our idea is never really build the roots or lock in and are successful in the long term. So we're building network on the ground in West Africa. We're identifying the entrepreneurs. We're putting resource broadly meant behind those entrepreneurs and letting them build the ecosystem. So we ask them to bring to the table everything they can, and we bring to the table where those missing gaps are. And I think in that partnership, we're starting to really move the needle in these countries and build systemic and human capacity in those instances. So this is very exciting for me, and I'm learning a lot from this group. So I appreciate this morning.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Gabrielle. And you brought up a number of points that actually had me thinking about Oliver Niedermaier, who himself is working in a focused way, but in areas that have the potential to, where successful, precipitate a ripple effect of social good. So Oliver, tell us about the work that you've done with Tau. You have been extraordinary. And to some of Gabrielle's points, you haven't simply sort of concocted big ideas for a certain region of the world from an ivory tower. You have, when I began working with your team, you have extended the invitation, which I gladly took, to go and tour garment factories in places like Vietnam, to see places where 8,000 people are working with not even a working toilet to be able to access. And you've pinpointed areas, these high density workspaces, where social and environmental gains can be achieved if in a tightly defined way, but again, that can achieve ripple effects throughout communities and countries and achieve that scale that Gabrielle referenced. So Oliver, tell us about your own journey. I know it hasn't been without its own frustration, as you've been a pioneer, particularly in impact-oriented private equity. Oliver?
Thanks a lot, Jami. And yeah, good to see a couple of old friends here again, and including you. Yeah, perhaps just as a starting point, I mean, Tau is an investment advisory firm focused on global supply chains and the transformation of global supply chains, starting with one of the most screwed up industries that's out there, which is textile and clothing or apparel manufacturing. And we basically got to this place in a way that I'm an entrepreneur and private equity investor, and I think capitalism, the way we practice it, and no matter what kind of labels we put on it, as a technology of allocating capital, is just simply not working, as probably most of you would agree. And when you think about where capital is going, and you think about the 100x that that Geoff was mentioning, we started thinking about global value chains, and we started thinking about global value or supply chains in a way where you can connect the bits and pieces and all players. So what I always found fascinating when you look at apparel or food or actually really basic value chains, or as the Japanese would call them, living essentials, you realize what's all wrong in the entire system. But nobody looks at it that way, because obviously a fashion retailer looks at the world in a certain way. A Bangladeshi employee looks at the world in a different way. A consumer looks at the world a different way. And as we have learned with COVID now, obviously, I think the world is just going through a crisis of connectivity. And if you actually start, and that's where activism, investment, storytelling all comes together in connecting these bits and pieces on a very human level, then I think you lay the foundation to really affect change at scale. Now, just thinking about your students, one aspect here is what I always thought, and I don't have any of the amazing life stories and backgrounds of some of our colleagues here. But I know what I and some of my colleagues were good at. And we were good at, with our entrepreneurial and private equity background, to understand how to invest in high-risk environments with a very operational thesis and go there and actually hopefully prove the point that you can actually achieve above-market returns by doing so, because you build more competitive players. So we looked at hundreds, and by now probably more than 500 factories in places like Southeast Asia that serve the biggest brands in the US and Europe. So we're basically looking at the value chains behind the Targets, the H&Ms, the Gaps of this world. And what you realize is that if you're actually willing to invest private capital with a for-profit thesis and a lot of technology applied and a lot of social and environmental thoughtfulness to it, you can create much more competitive players who ultimately are the better suppliers for the H&Ms and Gaps of this world. So everybody should, in theory, make money. If you make money, then you can prove the point that you can actually pay living wages, not pollute the environment and have a scalable effect. So by doing so, we have realized that what you need to achieve, and that's the storytelling point, is really you need to understand that this 22-year-old woman in Ho Chi Minh City that is right now scared to go back to her work, but also scared to go back to the countryside, because either way it's not a good life choice for her. That you need to connect her with the 22-year-old consumer or my 15-year-old daughter buying that stuff, but you also need to connect everybody in between. And if you create that kind of transparency, then actually you create also an understanding of how these value chains can actually work to the better for everybody. And what we're currently looking at, with your help, obviously, Jami, so we teamed up with Fairtrade USA, who have about 100 factories certified in across Asia, and it has been a long-term partner of ours. And we teamed up with you, obviously, on the global public health and infectious disease side, and we bring the investment expertise because we know how these factories work. And what we're trying to do right now is do a pilot, basically, with philanthropic support, where we identify 3 factories we know very well in Vietnam, Indonesia, and Bangladesh, with about 50,000 employees. And we create data around PPE, vaccination, education. We combine that data with storytelling. And we ultimately then are going to go to the industry organizations in all 3 of these countries and to the brands and say, okay, now how about you chip in some serious money and we do this properly, yeah? and scale this. And this is absolutely no rocket science. What is just fascinating is that you need somebody like us to bring together all of these players, because we're probably the only ones who understand what the frustrations are on the ground, why a factory owner doesn't trust his workers' council, and vice versa, why the brands don't trust the factory owner, and why therefore this is all stuck in limbo. So I think if I have one piece of advice for somebody who wants to scale impact through private investment, It's probably just focus on what you're good at and bring together some amazing people who can help you compensate for everything else. That's all we're trying to do.
Oh, fantastic. So lots of emphasis today, obviously, on connecting. I loved what you said. The world is living through a crisis of connectivity. And when I think of connection, I think of Pradeep. Pradeep, one of the last times that we saw each other, you might remember, actually brings up a topic that Gerhard raised. We went to Skopje, Macedonia together, which is actually the birthplace of some of the most, I think, important social entrepreneurs, certainly Mother Teresa. As I was walking through to see her birthplace, what was interesting there was how humble it was. An earthquake had actually destroyed the home where she was born, and all that was left was a simple bronze plaque to commemorate this extraordinary person. When I think of connectivity, and I also think of humility, I think of Pradeep, who very much embodies those principles, and seems to be everywhere at once, in Macedonia and elsewhere, as someone who's been within the UN system for a very long time. So, Oliver, you brought forward a really important point, that from a certain vantage point, you realize what's all wrong with the entire system. Now, Pradeep, from the perch of the UN, you have a fascinating and almost bird's eye view of systems at large and many players and actors within those systems. So tell us, what are you seeing from your unique vantage point? And what have you seen that gave rise to your new initiative, which you're now at the helm of, the UN Health Innovation Exchange? And what immediate challenges or opportunities do you see within the context of the exchange and what you're attempting to build? Pradeep?
Jami, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me here. It's really wonderful to see many mentors and people who have sewed into me, like Gerhard and Joanne and yourself, Jami. So really a pleasure to be here. Maybe I'll start with a little bit of my background. I started as a filmmaker. I come from India. Started as a filmmaker, was making films in the early days, in early 90s. And in 91, I was making a film on HIV when a very good friend of mine, who had put in front of the camera to just show how you get tested for HIV, tested positive. Then his wife was pregnant, she was positive, and the child was positive. So in those days, HIV was a death sentence, and that's where set up some of the early prevention programs. And then over the last 20 odd years, I've been a UN bureaucrat. So I was cruising along as a bureaucrat for the UN for quite some time. And then in 2018, I was a year away from turning 50, and I was sitting in one of these boring UN panels with several participants and ministers, and I was sitting next to one of the ministers, and I was just generally chatting and saying, look, in a year I'm going to turn 50, I'm at this crossroad, I don't know what to do, and I'm thinking about what I can do, what my life, you spoke about legacy earlier, so I was just thinking, okay, what do I do? And the minister basically said, if you were in my country, you wouldn't have much to worry about because you will have another year or maybe two, because the life expectancy was 52. And I was thinking about that because where I live today in Switzerland, the life expectancy is 86. 35 years is a long time for people to lose. And I know that it is not just basic access to healthcare. You know that 1 out of 2 people don't have access to healthcare, and COVID has really transformed that. It is going to be, probably it might get as worse as 2 out of 3 people not having access to basic healthcare. So I said, I need to do something about it. And I started thinking about, okay, and the idea was HIV has always been about innovation. When I started working on HIV, a person had to take 16 pills a day. There was no treatment in 91, but by early 2000, you had to take 16 pills a day to be alive. And now you have one single pill or one single injectable that your former company is now working on and doing extremely well, Jami. So I said, maybe innovation is the right place to be, and let me see how we can bring some of these ideas from the HIV world to broader health. And that's where what you said about connectivity, what I discovered was that we spoke to several ministers of health from Africa and Asia. And what came through was that almost every minister said, yes, we love innovation, but please, guys, it's great for you to sit in Boston or New York or Geneva or London to talk about innovation, but please do come and listen to what my pain points are, because otherwise you're bringing innovation and dumping it on us without really looking at what the challenges are. The second piece, which I think, Olivia, you also mentioned just a moment ago, it was about trust. It was fascinating to see, and we are living in a trustless world today. I mean, we know the challenges of trust today, but what every minister basically said was there is lack of trust. They did not trust any of the innovators nor the investors because they said everybody is trying to sell something to us or they're trying to exploit us by investing in us. So we said that is a big challenge. And the third problem was working on health after 3 decades. What I've realized is that most of the solutions, if you want to get to health targets and deliver healthcare, most of those solutions lie outside the health sector, whether it is the financial sector. Certainly, there's a huge challenge with insurance and other challenges there. The simple thing, one of the ministers I was sitting with, we spoke for about 30 minutes. At the end of it, he puts his arm around me and says, my brother, if you can do that for me, in 5 years, you'll be calling me Mr. President. That was about electricity for his health facility. So what I see is that we have a broken health system, which has been further weakened by COVID. There are disconnects within the health system, which is certainly there, but there's a huge disconnect. And one of our colleagues spoke about the disconnect between, and I completely agree with you, Gabrielle, about philanthropy is the worst possible form of having impact when it comes to health, but also broader development. Most of the challenges that we see there is that, one, there is not enough money, certainly. A lot of the money is really earmarked for pilot projects which never take to scale, and most of them are not sustainable. So I see a very fractured landscape, and maybe in just one minute I can certainly say I'm very optimistic because I'm seeing huge potential, and COVID has brought some attention to health, although I don't think a lot of the money is really flowing to where it needs to go. I know Gerhard has been one of the early pioneers when it comes to looking for investing in Africa for healthcare, but that hasn't taken off. If you look at private capital investment today, in the first 3 quarters of 2021, nearly $100 billion went into the world in terms of investments. Less than 3 million went into Africa. 3 billion went into Africa. And of that, if you start looking, 0.01% goes to health in Africa. And Africa accounts for a quarter of the disease burden. So there's a disconnected framework when it comes to investments. And what we do as Health Innovation Exchange is try to make sense of these, bring the partners together, bring them to connect them with each other. We work with ministers to identify their challenges. We work with innovators to find solutions that respond to those needs. And we work with investors to bring them into investing in those settings to take these to scale. Sorry, I've been a little bit all over the place, but I'll stop there, conscious of time.
No, that's fantastic, Pradeep, and we love your reflections. You bring such a powerful perspective. And you've given us a little bit of a drumbeat, as others have, over to Alice Lynn Fabiano from Johnson & Johnson. You mentioned my former company, which is J&J. I know, Gabrielle, you mentioned corporates and scale, which is certainly a challenge and one that Alice has been taking on with full vigor. Oliver, you mentioned global public health as a key piece of the work that you're doing. And Alice is leading now impact investing at J&J, having also had an illustrious career in philanthropy proper. So I think she can give us a really powerful perspective on this sort of evolution that J&J has undergone. And Alice, specifically, very recently, you published an article entitled Health, the Next Frontier for Impact Investing. And in it, you reflect upon Johnson & Johnson's own trajectory and engagement in impact investing for global public health. And I think in an important and reflective way, you talk about what the company has learned thus far, in addition to what it hopes to accomplish in the future. So Alice, can you give us another view on that article and share, for those that haven't read it, some of those key points that you've made in the piece?
Thanks, Jami. It's good to see you, and we miss you inside the walls of Johnson & Johnson, but see you're doing great things and continuing the great work. And it's really great to be here with the set of panelists, as well as with the students across at Yale. It's pretty tremendous. When I was in undergrad and in business school, you can probably count on one hand the number of folks who would come to this type of a panel, and nonetheless, the number of people who are on this panel. And so I start the conversation with a lot of optimism, enthusiasm around the last decade, and really how far the capital markets, business, society has all shifted, and which I'm going to be hopeful will be a better and more equitable future as we turn and hopefully turn into the next part of this pandemic. Jami, related to your question, maybe just to start, for folks who know Johnson & Johnson, we're the largest healthcare company in the world. And we look across efforts in consumer medical device and pharmaceuticals. My role, as Jami alluded to, has historically been within our philanthropic and our social impact part of the department. And in many ways, how I like to start that is Johnson & Johnson, no matter really where you're sitting, whether it be on my side of the philanthropy and the impact world or within our scientific community and our supply chains, there's a sort of value and a values-driven approach to everything that we look at doing. And how the model within impact investing started with us, I can just share. First was on the foundation side, and particularly as we looked across the huge societal needs and the growing healthcare needs in the world. You know, we constantly ask ourselves two questions. You know, are we delivering as much as we can for the needs and the most vulnerable around the world? And two is, you know, what are we best positioned to do? What are we best positioned to partner with? And at some point in time, as many folks on the phone also probably had, we looked across and we looked and said, listen, we do a lot of good. We give away about $1.5 billion of cash and product annually. It's gone up since then with the pandemic. But even that is a drop in the ocean for the needs that are out there. And so how do we kind of continue to multiply the impact of our dollar? How do we think about innovation, technology, creatively, the people, the ideas, the entrepreneur spirit to really not replace, I would say, because I do think there is a important and a continued importance role in philanthropy and charitable giving, but perhaps combine it with what the power of the markets can really do. And so that really started off the journey for us. And as we started to talk to a lot of the experts around who have been in the space of impact investing, we heard a number of things. The first one really being that while the market is growing exponentially, I think the last count I saw with Jin was $700 billion of impact investing dollars. Only 7% of it is really in health and public health. And we just heard Pradeep mention this as well. And you look at some of the needs in the world and where everything starts with health. And we asked ourselves why, you know, why is healthcare only 7%? And as we spoke to a number of folks, the answer really became quite clear that it was a lot around the medical and scientific expertise a number of folks felt was really needed, that deep bench that was really needed to do investing in healthcare well. And that really propelled Johnson & Johnson to take a step forward and say, listen, we have a role to play. We'd like to partner in this. We can bring not just some capital, but we can bring colleagues who sit alongside of us in the medical field, the scientific field, our supply chain experts. And we're a business and we know how to scale businesses. So perhaps we have something that we can do there as well. So that's really where it all began. We've learned a lot of lessons since then. Maybe I'll just share a couple of them for the sake of time. One is, I know a lot of folks on this call mentioned scale, 100x scaling up. For Johnson & Johnson, we started small. We said, listen, this is hard, this is big. Healthcare is local. We started in one market and we started with one security. We also started with partners who are already in there. So a number of our partners, whether it be on their venture capital side and have relationships on our business side or on our philanthropy side and nonprofit social enterprises. And we really started there. Now, a couple of years later, we've have a $50 million Johnson & Johnson Impact Ventures really fund, really looking to scale up entrepreneurs who are looking at new business models, closing the health worker gap that we see that's growing with the burnout of health workers during the pandemic, and also helping to address inequities. So one is start small, do what you do best. It's probably one of the things I'd share. The second insight I'd say is, healthcare is different. And, if you're looking at the same returns, the same timelines, even doing an MVP, right? You can't really go out there and do an MVP on people when it's life and death. And so you really have to be a little bit different around what healthcare impact investing is. And for us, that meant we had to go earlier. We had to take more risk than perhaps other sectors that weren't in healthcare. And then the final thing, perhaps with the audience in mind is, I wish there were so many opportunities and jobs out there when I was applying out of an undergrad to get into this space. I think a number of folks on the phone either had to create their own paths, or you had to kind of hop around in different places that had a little bit of what you wanted. And my advice for the students who are listening in is to kind of collect those experiences as you enter underway. You heard about the power of local experiences, like go local, work in a supply chain factory within Southeast Asia, go to a private equity or go to an investment bank, gain those hard technical skills you need around investments. Go look within the UN agencies. They're incredibly important, and development, which is incredibly important towards public health and developing economies. But really collect those experiences along the way and continue to keep that purpose in mind as you go forward. Thanks, Jami.
Oh, it's fantastic. And drawing upon Alice's advice to those who are seeking to enter the field, what I'd like to do is a round robin with everyone. And Alice, you've already achieved the goal for this particular piece. It's mainly, we expect that mainly students will be watching this, and top of mind for them might be, what advice could you give as they're looking at the field and how it's moving forward? So Nadza, if we could start with you and listen to some of the advice that you might give to anyone seeking to enter this space. And perhaps you could talk also a bit about how you are working to maintain the integrity of this space to secure its credible growth going forward. So Nadza, and then afterwards I'll call you out sort of one by one for some short responses with respect to advice to this rising generation.
Thanks, Jami. So I've been in the impact investing space now close to a decade, which I fully acknowledge makes me a rookie compared to most other people on this panel. But I did, I've went through quite a bit of a trajectory in the space. I entered it bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, thinking that impact investing is the panacea to everything that's wrong with this world, all the way to realizing it's a tool, an important tool, but not the only one that we need in order to address some of these complex issues, and that we need to remain critical in order to move the space forward. And, I've worked with many investors, developing financial mechanisms, blended financial mechanisms, and also deploying the capital in emerging markets throughout my career. And some of the things that I realized really digging into underlying investments were that there were quite a bit of red flags, even with impact investors. And just to put that into context, one of the investors I worked with is dedicated 50% of their portfolio to investments in Africa. And I would say about 75% of those underlying investments were run by entrepreneurs, white men from the US and Europe, who had fantastic ideas and had fantastic outcomes on the ground there. But ultimately, the equity that we were investing was flowing from the West to the West, and we weren't creating the systemic changes that were needed to empower local communities or even entire countries. And similarly in Latin America, when you look at the profiles of a lot of the founders that we work with, they tend to be Ivy League educated, foreign educated, with deep pockets and significant networks in the US especially. This is not reflective of what the majority of the population in Latin America looks like. And I'm not saying this as a full-out criticism on the investors, but mainly to point out that, or highlight that we in the impact investing space work within a flawed global economic system and are constricted by its flawed parameters. And to speak to Geoff's point, systems are created by people. And so as people, we can change them, and we shouldn't be scared to do so. And so for me, one of the guiding questions in this impact investing space has been not only as it matures and goes mainstream, how we can ensure that it remains with integrity, but beyond that, how do we set the bar for the rest of the market and help transform the way our capital markets work as a whole? And I don't think that's a pipe dream at all. You see a lot of advancements now in Europe with the regulations happening there now that are requiring a lot of the actors and asset managers to report an ESG risk regardless of whether they see themselves as sustainable and impact oriented, which has led to, I think, $2 trillion worth of funds removing the ESG or impact label from their products because they couldn't comply with those regulations, which to me is a fantastic step and shows that we as a space can be accountable and grow and build trust. So just to point out, I think my advice, echoing Alice's point, gather those experiences. I think it takes wearing quite many different hats in order to be successful and to understand the impact investing space, all the way from the entrepreneur experience to the investing space, but also remain critical and realize that we need to continue developing and growing and improving.
Absolutely fantastic. I think this sort of collective self-awareness is critical to the growth of the space. And I love what you said, systems are created by people. We are people, we can change them. Really great. So Aina, we were students together, so I'm curious, what sort of advice would you give to our former selves, considering who might have been and certainly were considering entry into this impact investing world?
Geez. I'm really trying to wrap my head around this answer, quite frankly. I think first and foremost, I will say specifically to the students, like, what would I tell my sort of 16-year-old self that sort of went into college 3 years after migrating into this country? And if I think about my career trajectory, I was a public health major in undergrad, pre-med major, wanted to go to medical school, worked for WHO, given what I saw in terms of health implications in Nigeria and in Africa as a whole. And I felt that change needed to come from someone that looked like me. And using my privilege that I have, as well as having parents who were able to migrate to the States. So that's a huge privilege. Some way, somehow, I kind of got sort of a redirection back to where I am today. And as I listen to every panelist, I'm like, oh my God, that is my existence. That is my existence. That is my existence. I spent 13 years. So I worked in public health and then moved over to biotech and then spent 13 years after getting laid off. So getting laid off has been incredibly impactful in my life. After getting laid off from a biotech company due to an acquisition, I moved to New York to be a fashion model. Was not in my existence, was not in anything at all, but an opportunity came to me at a club in Philadelphia, how random my life is. And I literally said, okay, I'm gonna move to New York. And this 13-year experience showed me the person I never knew existed within me. Their narratives around, and you know, it's gonna be slightly long-winded, just bear with me. Their preconceptions about what we should be based on who we are or based on what we look like. And I remember going into the world as a fashion model, working in shows, working with like global designers around the world. And I was always a sponge. Regardless of what space I was in, I stood there and realized that I wasn't just going to be a hanger. I was going to learn as much as I could learn, because this is a foundation to the next layer of what my life is going to look like. And I don't know what that thing looks like. So the one thing I will say to the students is always be open, because you do not know what you're going to find within who you are or the experiences that you're going through. Through that experience, I became a storyteller. I started producing content for other people and then for myself as well too. I raised capital for it. I call it a Friends, Family, and Fools Fund. Licensed my content to airlines globally around the world. And it was literally just like the term hustle. Just saying yes, hustling and going out and making sure that everyone that stands in front of you is a teacher and that you're a student of life. And then it kind of ties me back to the storytelling component of my parents. My dad was assistant director of finance for Nigeria. My mom was the director of information and culture in Nigeria. So literally my existence has become those two worlds. And as I think about that experience, going to business school, you don't know what you don't know. Once again, be open to lessons. And like I said, it's just 2 months in this role, in this sort of like impact vesting space. And I realized sitting across from, well, not across, you know what I mean, sitting sort of across in my head from all of you in here. And I'm like, God, damn, I don't know anything. So what am I going to do with the information that has been presented today to me to align myself back to my why, back to that 16-year-old girl, back to that 6-year-old girl. And that is what I'm taking away from this experience today. To speak here in Oliver, you know, Gabrielle, just everyone in here. And I'm like, wow, everyone is touching the essence of what my life has been. You've created your own path, but you're going somewhere. Continue, because you just don't know. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I was just saying, for me, it's just like being open to what the world has to give you, and understanding the importance of humility and vulnerability and being okay with that.
No, absolutely. I think you don't know what you don't know, which is often the case when we're dealing with very complex social problems, which is what impact investing often attempts to unravel and solve. And yet sometimes layers run very deep, and the number of factors contributing to a particular situation, it requires an enormous amount of humility to fully understand. And that certainly ties, I think, to what Nadza talked about in terms of that kind of self-critical aspect, constantly asking, are we on track with respect to mission and so forth? So absolutely fantastic. I know you mentioned Oliver and Gabrielle, so if the two of you could offer a little bit of advice to our listeners reflecting on your own journey as we prepare to close out in the next few minutes. Oliver?
Sure. Well, I'm not talking to my 16-year-old self, but to my almost 16-year-old daughter about that. And I think in simple terms, what I would say is probably that you can actually be deeply pessimistic about how screwed up the world is, which I am, and deeply frustrated about our solutions, from Mr. Zuckerberg's metaverse to Mr. Musk's multi-planetary whatever, on a planet that doesn't have anything to breathe or eat. So you can be deeply pessimistic about all of that, whilst you actually can still have fun trying to do something about it. And I think the way to do that is just with this human connection and going into the deep stories of people. I actually really enjoy talking to somebody in Ho Chi Minh who works in a factory. And I actually also really enjoy learning why the sourcing guy of a big brand doesn't care about that person in the factory. And I really do want to understand why teenagers are buying some stuff without thinking about that, which actually has changed dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years. So, and once you create that human connection and you identify how you can actually affect systemic change, make money, prove the point, whatever, with our different roles, and impact investing, as you said, is a tool in that. I think you can actually have fun while still being frustrated and agitated about climate change, social justice, inequality, and everything else. That's not great, to say the least.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Oliver. Gabrielle?
Yes, I spend a lot of time with college students and youth talking about this very thing. And my trajectory has been very nonlinear if you look at my resume. But the one thing that is linear is whether I was working in banking or asset management or Gap Corporate in their international digital strategy division, or where I am now. The thing that has always driven me and that I'm interested in is how to solve problems. And so my advice to anybody is, do the thing you see that needs doing, that nobody is doing. And we've talked a lot about system change today. How do we actually change systems? By doing that, right? Is we are the people behind the systems. And so as don't take what people have always done and always do as the blueprint for you. give yourself license to be creative. How do we create value, be more efficient, serve our businesses better, serve our customers, serve the world, all of those constituencies. And that will open doors for you, and it will lead to something that it brings satisfaction to you because you're solving those problems, you're building those platforms that others will use to develop the next layer of solutions. And so that's my big lesson. The other thing is a realization that I've had over the past couple years is I spend probably 80% of my time managing relationships and partnerships. That is huge, is understanding how to build these cross-beneficial relationships and partnerships. So all these constituencies and stakeholders have skin in the game and drive benefit from the solution that you're trying to put together. The moment those fall apart, especially in the healthcare realm, you're really not building a sustainable solution. And I think that's where the innovation is how you build together those partnerships. It is extraordinarily tricky, extraordinarily frustrating, but that really is the frontier in how we promote change across the sectors that we're all involved in. So those would be my two pieces.
Wow, I absolutely agree. And that bridges us right over to Joanne and Pradeep. Joanne and Pradeep, first Joanne, then Pradeep, if you'll offer some insights. I love this idea of managing relationships and the importance of innovation therein and the importance of a focus there. And certainly that's so much of what you do day to day. So Joanne.
Thank you, Jami. Well, I guess I'm going to close my comments with something controversial, is that I always find in the work that we do, it's not lack of money, right? We always find that when we create these funds, there's a lot of money to be deployed by governments and by others. It's really structuring them correctly, right? And that's why you need those partnerships, because frequently I find to get to the finish line of the actual launch of some sort of fund, at a couple of hundreds of millions of dollars is very easy. It's what happens next. And so for your students, I would say really implementation, right? And in order to implement correctly, you need those who are willing to, as Gerhard and Pradeep know, and I've worked with them in this, care about the individual at the end of the day. Because if you're going to deploy a $500 million fund, but you don't care about that individual at the end of the day, nothing is going to get done correctly. And we've seen that already. We unfortunately saw that with, a fund that we helped to structure 4 years ago. Great fund, 600 million or so. It's not impacting the individual, right? So, to all of us, to the students, it's really not about raising the money. It's about how you create impact with that money. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Jami, again.
Wow, such an important perspective. Thank you. Pradeep.
Thanks, Jami. Just reflecting on my own experience, I think I would say 3 major lessons. 1, fear. I think most of us are debilitated by fear, asking the difficult questions, looking like fools in front of others, making assumptions. I think being a UN, as I said, I was in a very comfortable space. Getting into innovation, 3 weeks into that work, I was threatened by somebody that, oh, you're going to get fired because you've done this. And you start working in that fear and you put limitations. So how do you get out of that? Do not get into fear. Do not let fear dominate your life. And especially as a young person, I know, let not others' fears be imposed on you. That's my first lesson. And I've seen that time and again, and it doesn't stop with as you grow older, it only gets worse. So do not let fear conquer your life, conquer it. The second one is integrity and trust. And what I'm seeing, and we run an investor coalition that brings venture capital firms with family offices, with DFIs. And what we saw is that, one, it's such a fractured landscape and nobody's really connecting those. And how do you really start breaking those barriers and building trust? And I remember Gerhard saying in one of my early conversations, in the financial world, if you say something, you can trust that. That doesn't apply to the development world, unfortunately. So how do you really build integrity as an individual? Because that is what everybody is going to look to. And if you want to break those barriers and bring people together and connect, you need to be trusted. You need to be able to build trust. 3, be humble. I do believe most of the learning that I've ever seen for me, I think, Oliver, you were talking about speaking to textile workers. I've learned from people on the street children, sex workers, people who have been thrown out of houses. So be open to learn from everyone. Everyone can be your teacher. I'll stop there.
Oh, incredible. Pradeep, I've always known you as someone fearless and someone of immense integrity and a man whom I personally trust infinitely. So thank you for living into those values and that mission. Geoff, your advice to those who might be listening in either now or in the future?
Yeah, I'll try to be somewhat quick given our time. First of all, I'd say I agree. I love that we've focused on these characteristics, if you want to call them, being fearless, being entrepreneurial, acting with integrity. I think those are crucial, and we need to instill those even more in ourselves and in everybody. But I'm going to give a very practical answer. So I agree with those, and we could spend 2 hours on the lessons we've all learned and the importance of caring about the individual and acting with integrity and all of that. I'm going to give a practical answer. I'm going to call it the triple threat. So if you're kind of early on and you're trying to figure out how do I get into this space, here's the potential triple threat. 1, develop technical skills somehow, whether it's financial analysis or measurement and evaluation or whatever, but a technical skill is incredibly valuable in this space broadly. 2nd, domain focus, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, something of poverty, some aspect. 3rd, either geographical understanding or a role-based understanding. Role meaning like Pradeep at the UN, or a nonprofit, or a corporate like the Gap, like Gabrielle mentioned, or something, but some type of role or geography experience. So the triple threat: technical, domain expertise, and some type of geographic or role-based. You can do these through your classes, but also through internships and summer jobs. And that would be a very good way to get started into this space and get hired. It's very difficult. The space has evolved enough now that it's hard to say, I really care about this, so I want to go work in this space, and say, oh great, I'll take a generalist and come join me. It's somewhat tough, but if you develop these triple threat skills, you have a better chance. And I'll say collectively, I know a lot of the young people are concerned about global warming and wondering, is it even worth it to finish school? Is it worth it to try to get a job? Is there going to be anything in 2030, 2040, etc.? The answer to that is yes, it's worth it. We'll be here. We will figure this out. You will play a large role in figuring this out. We need you to figure it out. We know that we've played a large role in causing the problem, and we're working on it, but we need you to have the courage and the idealism and the hope and the tenacity to really do it. So with that, I'm done. Thanks, Jami.
Fantastic. And then we'll let Gerhard have the final word here. Now, so Gerhard, when we first met, we were in the Addis Ababa airport in Ethiopia in a crowded so-called business lounge with many broken chairs. You'll probably remember the dirty sheet that demarcated the space. It was hot, it was uncomfortable. And I remember sitting next to you and just being struck by, then as I am now, how comfortable you were, how perfectly suited you were to the environment despite the stark lack of luxury, and how you approached it all with this tremendous sense of humor and seemed to be really relishing the time spent there. What character traits, clearly unique, have you brought to the table that have helped you to shape the space in such powerful and fundamental ways?
Well, Jami, that's far too generous. But let me quickly, because we're over time now already, quickly on three things for the students that may be listening. Number one is you need hard skills. Oliver said that the garment industry is perhaps one of the most screwed up or most problematic in industries. Actually, I think our sector, the financial sector, is probably the most corrupt, unethical, immoral sector out there. There's money, you're working with money, and so the greed just grabs it. We are in a very immoral sector. But as Alice said, you need hard skills. Heart isn't enough. You need hard skills. So despite the fact that the financial sector, the one that we live in, is, I would say, not just amoral but immoral, learn it, because you need those skills. Secondly, forget the next cool solution that comes across. think in 20 to 50-year time horizons. Invest in the big ideas. Remember that. Invest in the big ideas. That's the important thing, because climate crisis did not happen quickly. It's not going to be solved tomorrow. Think in 20, 50-year time horizons. The third one is be Anthony Bourdain. What's Anthony Bourdain? He was curious. He was curious about food. He was curious about culture. Focus on food. When you're going into impact investment, you're investing with others. Learn about them. Be curious about them. Ask what they eat. Enjoy their food. Go around the world and be curious about food. Think of being Anthony Bourdain, because that guy was just curious. He was in there all the time. And through that comes that human connection and a lot of brilliant ideas that you had never thought of in the life that you've been living. So number one, you need hard skills. Number two, invest in the big ideas. And number three, Jami, I'd say, be Anthony Bourdain.
I love it, that infinite curiosity and that openness that we've discussed. Well, thank you all for spending this wonderful Sunday afternoon here virtually at Yale University. It was such an honor for me to be able to spend time with you. I'd almost hold back tears of joy as you were coming onto the Zoom screen, seeing so many good friends in this space and knowing all of the good work that you've done. I also want to thank our host organization, Yale University, Academics Stand Against Poverty, and all those who participated today and will participate in the discussion going forward. So thank you, and I'll turn the time over to our faculty sponsor, Thomas Pogge. Thanks to everyone for joining.
Yes, thank you very much to you all for doing this wonderful discussion, and thank you, Jami, for organizing it.